Good afternoon. I'm Merit Jano, Dean of SEPA, and it's my real pleasure to welcome our distinguished guests to SEPA and indeed all of you. I'd like to first welcome Dr. Vidal, Provost Coatsworth, who is our host, distinguished Cuban guests, and also to thank the Institute of Latin American Studies, with whom we at SEPA have co-sponsored this event. One of the great things about being part of SEPA and indeed Colombia, I think, is our history of hosting important leaders in policy and business throughout the academic year, and indeed our commitment to addressing critical issues in public policy, whether they be national, international, or global. I think it is one of the reasons that this school is, in fact, a leading school of global public policy. And I think we are well situated to convene students and scholars from around the world and create a dialogue with leaders from every sector and every country. And I hope that today's discussion provides all of us in the audience with a new understanding of Cuban-U.S. relations and the possibilities for the future. It is my great pleasure to introduce someone who really needs no introduction to us, Provost John Coatsworth. But it's the first time I've had the pleasure of doing so, so I shall do so at great length. Provost Coatsworth is, of course, a leading scholar of Latin American economic and international history. He served as an outstanding dean of SEPA before becoming provost here at Columbia University in 2012. He previously served as the Monroe Goodman Professor of Latin American Affairs at Harvard University, where he was also the founding director of Harvard's David Rockefeller Center for Latin American Studies and chair of the Harvard University Committee on Human Rights Studies. He's a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Council on Foreign Relations, the board of directors of the Tinker Foundation, and numerous professional associations, and former president of the American Historical Association and the Latin American Studies Association. An outstanding scholar, a strong proponent of open dialogue. We're so happy to have him here at SEPA, and thank you for hosting tonight. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Merit, for that generous introduction. Though I have strayed from SEPA to other tasks, it's always a pleasure and sometimes even a relief when I'm able to return to this great school. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all this evening, and an even greater pleasure to be back here. A warm welcome to all of you, and especially to the distinguished members of the Cuban delegation here this evening. I would like to thank SEPA and its terrific new dean, as well as the Institute of Latin American Studies, for co-hosting this event. Special thanks are also owed to the director of the Institute of Latin American Studies, Professor Jose Moya, and to the wonderful director of ILAS's growing and vibrant Cuban program, Professor Margaret Crahan, for making this evening possible. Cuba and the United States have changed dramatically over the past half-century, but Cuban-U.S. relations still do not resemble normal relations between sovereign states. That may be changing. Our speaker this evening is one of Cuba's leading Americanologists. Is that a word? She is Doctora Josefina Vidal, Director of the United States Division of the Cuban Ministry of Foreign Relations. I first met Josefina when she served as first secretary in the Cuban Interests Section in Washington. Our two countries do not have normal embassies in each other's capitals. Instead, we have a section theoretically located in somebody else's embassy, though actually in their own buildings, where normal diplomatic activity can be undertaken. By the time I met Josefina, she had already studied international relations in Cuba and in Moscow, worked at a University of Havana think tank devoted to the study of the United States, served as an analyst in the Cuban embassy in Paris, and coordinated the U.S. analysis group in the North American division of the Foreign Relations Ministry. She is a perceptive and sophisticated student of U.S. politics and policy. During her time in the Cuban Interests Section in Washington, from 1999 to 2003, Josefina worked hard and effectively to keep open cultural and academic ties between the two countries in the face of renewed hostility from Washington. She returned to Havana to resume her work in the North American Division in 2003 and assumed the direction of this division, now the U.S. Division, in 2006. In that position, she has sought to improve U.S.-Cuban relations while protecting the country's independence and serving its foreign policy goals. I am quite certain she knows more about the United States than most U.S. officials that she deals with know about Cuba. What those U.S. officials tell me is that she is extremely smart, as tough-minded as she is flexible. Most important of all, she is described as a reliable, authoritative, and extremely capable negotiator. Quote, "She doesn't miss a trick," one U.S. official said to me recently, "but she doesn't pull any either." Perhaps for all these reasons, Josefina has been playing a key role in the extensive and potentially fruitful conversations, the first since the Clinton era, that have taken place over many months between officials of our two governments. The talks have covered a range of issues, including mail service and telecommunications, managing migration, combating drug and human trafficking, protecting the environment, and cooperation in responding to natural and man-made disasters. I'm looking forward to hearing her perspective on relations between Cuba and the United States. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Doctora Josefina Vidal.
You prefer that I go there?
Either way, whichever you prefer.
Okay. I can do it. Thank you very much. I would like to begin my presentation extending my gratitude to Columbia University, especially the School of International and Public Affairs, and also ILAS, the Institute of Latin American Studies, and in particular, Professor John Cotsworth, whom I met maybe 1999, 2000, when I was based in Washington, and one of my responsibilities was to visit from time to time American universities that at that moment had some programs, exchange programs with Cuba. Provost Cotsworth was the head of the David Rockefeller Center at Harvard University, and at that time they had a huge program, different schools from Harvard involved in exchange activities with mainly with Havana University, but with other Cuban institutions. I want to thank to Dr. Mary Jano for having me here this evening, Dr. Meg Crahan. She is the one behind this activity, keeping me informed about everything from New York and making every effort to make sure that I could be with you this evening, looking for the best time to do it. So thank you very much, Meg, and Maritza Colon, too, for the invitation. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here to share some views with you about things that are happening in Cuba. Unfortunately, not all the time. The press, the media informs deeply with substance about the complex developments and transformations that are taking place right now in my country, and also my views and our views on the future of United States-Cuban relations. Concerning what is taking place in Cuba, I should begin saying that things are changing quite significantly in our country. We are at the beginning of a process of deep economic transformations, structural transformations in the Cuban economy. I would like to mention some of the most important traits that are present in what we are doing now in Cuba. For example, there is a downsizing of the state workforce. There is a huge expansion of the private sector and an expansion also of the cooperative sector to include non-agricultural activities, because before that moment, cooperative existed only mainly in the agricultural sector of our economy. We have been distributed more and more land in usufruct to increase the production in our agriculture, which is one of the problems we are facing that we have to solve. We have relaxated the credit policy to support and encourage private activity, but also to support activities by people, by persons. This is a change in our country. We have been eliminating in the last 2-3 years subsidies and freebies. We had plenty in Cuba. We have had plenty in Cuba for many years. We are giving more autonomy to state enterprises, but also to local governments in Cuba. We have eliminated also unneeded restrictions that existed for different activities in the country. We are in the process now of reviewing the procedures for foreign investment in Cuba, which is going to be a key factor for the future economic development of the country. These are only some of the measures that we have been adopting in the last 2 to 3 years. From now on, the most complex steps will start to be taken. The more complex because it's a matter of devising and designating and putting in place policies that will have an impact in our overall economy, in macroeconomics in Cuba. For example, in the next 5 years, we have to devise a new credit policy, a new price and monetary policy. We have to update the Cuban tax code. We just put in force a new tax code, but it has to go through a process of updating after the reform of salaries is also made in Cuba in the next few years. We have to devise a policy very soon, because this is a problem for the Cuban economy, to eliminate the dual currency system. We have 2 currencies in Cuba, and this is a headache for every economist in Cuba, for every enterprise, for every person that has to deal with that. And we know that this has to be changed, and this is in our plans to do it also as part of the economic transformations that we are taking. This is the most important things that we have started to do now and that we are planning to do in the next few years. The goal, what is the overall goal of this reforms, of these changes, is to consolidate the Cuban economy, is to make the economy more efficient, and to develop in Cuba a more sustainable and prosperous economic and social model for the Cuban population. This process, in the political front, the process of transfer of the key government positions from the old generation to the new generation has already begun in Cuba. And this is a process that will be completed in the next few years. We have already a parliament in Cuba, which is more diverse, with a better representation of young people, women, Black Cubans. All these changes in the economic and political life of Cuba will have a reflection in the modification of the Cuban Constitution, which, among other things and other aspects, shall limit the mandates of government and elected officials in Cuba. This process is happening not without difficulties. Of course, there are obstacles all the time. We have had to review some of the policies we have been adopted as a result of the experiences we have making. And we have we will continue introducing other corrections in the future. But I can say now that Cuba has changed more in 2-3 years than it had in the previous 20 years. And we will continue changing everything that needs to be transformed with the purpose, as I told you, of attaining a sustainable and prosperous model in our country. From the international point of view, the point of view of foreign policy, Cuba's foreign policy, Now we have diplomatic relations with 184 countries in this region, in this continent. We have relations with every country but the United States. Cuba has become a key and respected factor in the region, in Latin America and the Caribbean. We are currently presiding over the new Community of Latin American and Caribbean Countries, which is a new organization that has been founded in our region. I can say also that Cuba is a factor of stability in Latin America. For example, we are playing an important role as a guarantor of the peace process in Colombia, which is a very complex process we are trying to help to solve. So Cuba is changing. What is not changing fundamentally yet is U.S. policy towards Cuba. The United States seems to be ignoring these transformations that are taking place in our country, even when some of these transformations for many years were presented by the United States government as preconditions, prerequisites for the U.S. to change its approach and its policy towards Cuba. The United States government, from our point of view, is wasting opportunities to participate in the transformations taking place in Cuba that could provide interesting options for American companies in areas like oil drilling, energy production, telecommunications, infrastructure development, biotechnology, the pharmaceutical industry, just to mention a few examples of the most dynamic sectors now that we are developing in Cuba. Moreover, we believe that the United States is becoming more and more isolated in the region and has been put in a very uncomfortable position when every single leader of Latin America and the Caribbean is asking directly and publicly the United States government to lift the sanctions on Cuba, what you call the embargo, and we call the economic, financial, and trade blockade of Cuba, and also to let them invite Cuba to be part of the new forums that exist in the region, like the Summit of the Americas. Cuba and the United States are neighbor countries. We share many historical and cultural experiences, and we could gain a lot from a mutual beneficial relationship based on common interest and respect for our differences. In the very few areas where we have been able to establish some levels of cooperation between Cuba and the United States, although limited cooperation, we have been able to show that we could be good partners. For example, in the area of drug interdiction, alien smuggling interdiction, aviation security, military-to-military regular talks that take place in Guantanamo. So the United States has this experience, even in these cases of limited cooperation, that we can be good partners for the United States. And there is more to gain than to lose from interactions between our two countries. We would like to see progress in the relations between Cuba and the United States. We believe that there are favorable conditions now in this country and in Cuba to do that. For example, we feel that there is a growing consensus in many sectors of the American society in favor of a different approach towards Cuba. There has been an important change in the perceptions of the Cuban American community in the United States that supported President Obama in 2012 in record numbers in the last elections. And one of the reasons why they did it was because they were supportive of the new measures that President Obama started taking towards Cuba in his first 4 years as president. Different polls in the U.S. reflect a majority support for changes in the Cuba policy. Hundreds of thousands of Cuban Americans and Americans are voting with their feet when they visit Cuba every year, part of it as a result of the opening for travel to Cuba in the last 4 years. Moreover, I have to tell you that Cuba's decision to advance in its relations with the United States is final and firm. The Cuban government has conveyed to the United States its willingness to start a respectful dialogue on every issue without preconditions at the level which is more comfortable for the United States and whenever and wherever is more convenient for the United States. In our view, a conversation like this could lead to a true improvement of relations between Cuba and the United States that would allow us to find solutions to the problems that have accumulated for more than 50 years and to design and identify new areas for mutual beneficial cooperation. At the same time, so we have forwarded to the United States government this message that we are willing and ready to have this, to start this dialogue, overall dialogue. At the same time, we have presented to the United States several areas where we can cooperate and benefit from each other. For example, we have given to the United States several ideas and proposals to expand the existing cooperation in the area of fighting combat against drug trafficking, alien smuggling, and terrorism. We have presented a proposal to establish collaboration in the area of the protection of the environment that we both share. In the area of prevention of natural disasters, we all of the two of us, we suffer from the same problems, phenomena like hurricanes. We have presented, for example, another proposal for the protection, mutual protection of trademarks and patents, American and Cubans in each other country. We feel pleased that about the fact that at the beginning of this second term, President Obama's second term, the United States government has decided to renew several talks and conversations with Cuba, as the migration talks or the talks to reestablish direct postal service, mail service between Cuba and the United States, and also about the fact that new possibilities may emerge to cooperate in other areas of common interest, like response to oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico, search and rescue operations, aviation safety and security, just to mention the new ones about which we are discussing right at this very moment. But this is not enough. These technical meetings, these technical conversations are good to build confidence and to show that we can work together, but this is not enough. At the same time, at the same moment that we are doing all these things that I just mentioned, we notice that the foundations of U.S. policy remain unchanged. The strict economic sanctions against Cuba, financial trade, are in place, and they are implemented with a lot of rigor. You say that? Efforts to subvert Cuba's internal order are still there, supported with budgets of millions, worth millions of dollars. The U.S. government, unfortunately, insists on the arbitrary and unfounded designation of Cuba as a state sponsor of international terrorism, which is a unilateral exercise by the U.S. government, which is humiliating for Cuba, the less I can say. It's insulting for Cuba because we discovered many, many years ago what terrorism is. More than 50 years ago, we were victims of terrorism until recently, until 1997. So this is something that has to be changed. So the United States has to change all those things and leave behind the Cold War policy, the outdated Cold War policy that only exists now for Cuba, not for anybody else. We strongly believe that it is high time for us, Cuba and the United States, to start a conversation, a very much needed conversation, to move on and to begin creating the basis of a civilized and mature relationship between our two countries, emphasizing what unites us and not what divides us. We should leave the past behind and look into the future for the benefits of both countries and for the Cuban people and the American people. We are ready to begin that process of engagement with the United States. But while that moment comes, that moment arrives, waiting for the United States to make this decision to change its policy towards Cuba, we will continue on our path. We will continue making all the domestic changes in our economy, in our society that are needed. We will continue strengthening, as we are doing, our economy and the integration of Cuba to the region. And we will continue diversifying our foreign international relations and trade relations. And we certainly believe that at some point the United States should decide if it wants to be part of this process that is taking place in Cuba or if it wants to continue being isolated from them. Thank you very much, and I'm open to your questions.
If you have questions you'd like to direct to the speaker, you can fill them out on index cards, and I'll sift through them and ask the toughest ones. Thank you, Josefina, for a very interesting talk. I've already begun to receive some interesting questions, and this is perhaps the most general one, but one I'm sure that preoccupies Cubans as well. The question is, how does Cuba plan to remain an independent country, diplomatically, if it becomes more integrated into the global economy? Won't Cuba lose some of its independence?
I don't think so. We are more and more integrated to the global economy. We are receiving almost 3 million tourists every year, which is a big number for a small island like Cuba. So we have been open to foreign interactions and foreign influence forever, for many years now. There is, as I said, foreign investment in Cuba. There are many countries which has been accompanying Cuba in what we have been doing. At the same time, Cuba has been helping many countries abroad, and I haven't seen, on the contrary, I haven't seen that we have lost our capacity to continue being a very independent and sovereign country. This is one of the things we more value in Cuba, and this is a source of problems sometimes, many times, with the United States whenever we have had the possibility to talk or to discuss certain things. We are very jealous about protecting our independence and our sovereignty. Cuba is a country that, as a matter of fact, and experience shows that, does not respond to pressures from anybody. And we have been able to have a very active foreign policy. We are present in many countries of the world with embassies or consular offices, or through Cuban doctors or teachers or sport trainers which are helping other countries. So we have been very active abroad, and we have been receiving many foreigners in Cuba, and I haven't seen so far that it has damaged our independence or sovereignty. So this is something that we will take care of the day we finally can have a relationship with the United States. But we think it is possible. We think it is possible.
Josefina, I noticed that in your speech you didn't mention a series of changes that have occurred in Cuba that are related to personal liberties, or at the very least removing of individual irritations. And these involve the decision to allow most Cubans to leave the country with a passport and without requiring any particular special permission. The liberalization of rules governing domestic tourism so that Cubans can have access to the same tourist facilities that the rest of us do. It involves the freedom of Cubans to sell automobiles and trade apartments and so on.
Yes.
But here's a question that comes from the son of a Cuban. He says, the question is, in the past, I have helped distribute short-wave radios to the people of Cuba. Could you explain why this constitutes a crime according to your government?
No, it is not a crime. You can buy a radio in Cuba. What is the crime is to have a foreign power, which is the United States, sending radios to Cuba, hidden radios through the diplomatic pouch to be distributed in Cuba. And these radios are bought with your money, with taxpayers' money, as part of programs that are run by the State Department, in particular by USAID. And USAID, unfortunately, does not do with Cuba what maybe they do with other countries. And the only programs that USAID runs for Cuba are programs which are aimed at provoking a political change in Cuba. And this is not permitted. So it is not permitted either in the United States. It's a foreign country. Use these tricks in order to introduce things. It could be radios, but it could be other things. It is not prohibited. What is prohibited is to have the United States doing that through the back door without the consent of the Cuban government and without our approval, and for other purposes which are different from what we are trying to do in Cuba. So this is the difference.
So in Cuba, you can go to a store and you can purchase a shortwave radio and listen to...
And cell phone and whatever.
Does Cuba jam Radio Marti and
yes,
TV
of course
Marti?
we do. And there was a very interesting piece the other day in the Washington Post, I think, speaking about that, how useless these broadcasts are, because nobody listens to that, nobody watches. In Cuba, we say la TV que no se ve, the TV no one sees, because this is also part of the United States, what we perceive in Cuba, hostile policy to beam, to broadcast, special designated towards Cuba programs, TV, radio programs. It doesn't mean that we don't see in Cuba American shows. They're all shown on Cuban TV. They are all distributed through flash memories in Cuba. I am a fan of The Good Wife and Grey's Anatomy and Newsroom, and all these shows are shown on Cuban TV. All the last movies from Hollywood and the Oscars are shown on Cuba. So because the American culture is not strange for Cuba, it is not. But what we are against is programs funded by the United States government as part of a hostile policy towards Cuba to beam or to broadcast special propaganda programs towards Cuba, which, by the way, are illegal under International Telecommunications Union regulations and radio communications regulations. And that's the reason why, from the very beginning, since those programs started in 85 and 90, Cuba has jammed them, as part of the protection of this, which is perceived as an aggression, using the waves in order to bring propaganda into Cuba. This is not the way to deal with Cuba. So there are many studies in the United States about the waste of money in times of fiscal problems in the United States, keeping those programs, which cost a lot of money. They have costed over $600 million since 1985 of your money. And this is useless. This is useless. And this is a violation of our sovereignty and international regulations.
So you don't object to shortwave radio, you just object to
these special programs. Cubans have shortwave radios, and we listen to everything. Miami programs and musical programs for the United and every international broadcast from Spain, from Radio Netherlands, Canada, The Voice of America. My grandfather used to listen to it a lot.
Here's another tough question. The questioner asks, why did Cuba reject Edward Snowden's plans to fly from Moscow to Latin America through Cuba?
I have to tell you.
This was a fact.
I have to tell you what happened in this case, and Cuba's position is we defend and we support the right of every country in this region because there is a tradition in Latin America to grant political asylum, and we have done that in Cuba too. We have helped many Chileans that left Chile in 1973, for example, to give you a more recent example. So we defend the right of every country of the region to do that. But at the same time, I have to tell you that none of the actors in this whole thing, because there are many actors involved, requested Cuba a special thing on that regard. And we acted sovereignly without any special request, and of course without any kind of pressure.
So there was on the news broadcast in the U.S., we were shown pictures of the empty seat in the Cubana plane that was, at least at one point, was reported to have been purchased.
Aeroflot, not Cubana.
Was the Aeroflot plane that was supposed to be flying to Havana, and the seat in which that Edward Snowden didn't take. So he had not applied for asylum or for transit?
We have not received any special requests on that regard, not from the United States, not from Russia, not from... So.
Or from Snowden himself?
Oh, not special requests.
You can see I'm picking out the toughest questions. Questioner asks, if you are interested in confidence-building measures with the United States, what about that July 2013 North Korean ship that was passing through the Panama Canal with a load of arms? This is, the questioner suggests, hardly what you would do if you wanted to build confidence.
I know. But did you see the United States reacting to that? I mean, this is part of our foreign policy. We have had relations with North Korea for a long time. By the way, the United States citizens are allowed to travel to North Korea, not to Cuba, which is something very strange.
In fact, a group from SIPA went to North Korea just last year.
And musicians and whatever. We have a relationship with North Korea. We have always had relationship with North Korea. There is nothing new there. We have had relations with many others, 184 countries. And this is part of the military cooperation we have had with North Korea. So we have been open about that. We have been public about that. We haven't seen any special reaction, by the United States government regarding that. So I don't see how, really, that can affect what we have been doing and what we have been talking about. I think you have to have respect for what countries do as foreign and as sovereign nations, as sovereign states. We may have opinions about certain special relationships that the United States may have with certain allies, but it's up to the United States to decide with whom they want to relate. So we demand and we want to be given the same right. And we have relations with them, and there is nothing strange in that regard.
The next question is, we have a lot of questions, and you're doing...
No problem.
Question is, what do you think would be the impact, if any, of a change in government in Venezuela?
Change in government in Venezuela. You know that Venezuela is a very important trade partner for Cuba now. Venezuela, China, Brazil, Spain, Canada. So it's not just Venezuela. Of course, they have been selling oil with good prices to Cuba, but not only to Cuba. We are just one component of the whole program that Venezuela has developed, which is known as PetroCaribe, to help less developed countries as Cuba to receive oil, which is very expensive now, for our own development. So we are one of in the region. There are many others who are receiving oil with special prices, but it is not for free. At the same time, we have been exporting a lot of services to Venezuela and to many other countries. Cuba has become and is becoming a more service-oriented economy. And one of the most important income generating sectors in Cuba is export of medical services. And we are doing that to Venezuela. So it's a convenient relationship for both of us. So it's not a unilateral, unbalanced relationship. So we benefit, but Venezuela benefit also from this relationship. If that changes, of course, we have to look to other sources, but that's, we are not, as I told you, we have been making changes in Cuba, and we are diversifying our relations with other countries, and we are in the process. We started 2 years ago to look for oil in Cuba's economic zone. Geologists say there is oil because there is oil in Mexico, there is oil in the south of the United States, so there should be oil in Cuba too, because this is the same Gulf of Mexico region. So we started to do that, and we have several companies from different countries which have been investing in that effort. We drilled 5 wells. Not successful, but the Norwegians did it 29 times. So we have hopes to find oil. And at the same time, there is a new program which is being developed in Cuba in the area of renewable energies. So, energía solar.
Solar.
Solar energy, wind energy. So, because we know we have to do it too. Everybody's doing that. The United States is doing that too. So, we have made, I think, a long time ago, an important and strategic decision not to depend on one country. We did it for many years. We didn't have any options. In the case of the United States, we depended totally on the United States. And in 1959, when things changed in Cuba, we faced a huge problem and a huge crisis when the United States decided to cut every link with Cuba. We did it a second time with the Soviet Union, and we depended almost on them and several other socialist countries from Eastern Europe. And we had a severe, I think the most severe crisis, economic crisis in Cuba in the early 90s, because that started when the collapse of the Soviet Union happened. So at that point, we made this decision not to put all the eggs in the same basket. So we started to diversify our foreign trade and foreign relations, and that's the reason why you see a combination of different countries being the first Cuban trade partners or investors or source of tourism, and you find there Canada, Spain, China, Venezuela, Brazil, and other countries.
Thank you. The next question comes from somebody who would like, who mentions that you did not mention the Cuban 5, although today I think it's the Cuban 4, and asks how does their fate fit into your vision of U.S.-Latin American relations? And just I would add, because of press accounts that seem to link this, the question of the American citizen contractor Gross, Alan Gross?
Sí, yes.
Alan Gross, who is in prison in Cuba. Many press accounts have linked these two groups. Can you say something about the relationship of this to Cuban-U.S. relations?
Because of the brief presentation I made, I didn't want to get into details, but I have to tell you that one of the first things we did when Obama came to office was to send again to the United States government this message about our willingness to start a dialogue and conversation and overall dialogue to solve our problems. So we presented to the United States government a list of the things, the topics, the points that Cuba will have in its agenda the day we finally decide to sit down on a negotiating table to find solutions to all our problems. And in that list, you will find many things, to begin with the Cuban embargo, the embargo on Cuba, the economic sanctions on Cuba, also Cuba being on the so-called terrorist list of the State Department, but also the freedom of the Cuban Five is part of our agenda with the United States, and the return back to Cuba of Guantanamo, the territory occupied by Guantanamo, but also the end of those programs, the so-called democracy promotion programs that are run by USAID and the State Department and are a source of problems and conflicts. And this is the reason why we have an American who is in prison in Cuba, because he was implementing one of those programs by USAID illegally in Cuba without the authorization, the approval, and the consent of the Cuban government. And there are many other issues in that, like, for example, eliminating these broadcasts against Cuba. So the case of the Cuban Five is there, of course. We care a lot about them, as the United States cares about the situation of Mr. Alan Gross. It's normal, because there are humanitarian concerns present in both cases. So this is part of the issues that we would like to have the possibility to discuss with the United States. And we have conveyed already also to the United States that we are ready and that we are willing to have a special conversation about how to find a solution to the case of Mr. Gross. But this is something that Cuba will not do unilaterally, because the United States government is responsible for the fate and the situation of Alan Gross, because it was the United States government who sent him to Cuba. We didn't invite him to go there. So this is why we are telling to the United States government, we are ready to sit down with you together to find the best way, a formula to solve this problem. But this formula has to take into consideration the concerns and the humanitarian concerns that Cuba also have with certain Cuban people who are imprisoned in the United States, to begin with the Cuban Five. So this is something that we have conveyed.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for many more questions, but I have two. One is the question, two from the same person. The question is, how can we get SIPA students to Cuba? Which I think is really a question for the dean, or maybe for the folks from the Institute for Latin American Studies.
Yes, yes.
But the second is a question for you. What would be the first thing we should do or experience on arriving in Havana?
What a question. Talk to the Cuban people. So it is important, I think. I invite everybody to do that. You are free to do that when you go to Cuba, because the Cuban people is good people. And no matter how much animosity there has been and isolation between Cuba and the United States for political reasons for so many years, the Americans are not treated badly in Cuba. On the contrary, because we have many connections with the United States. Many Cuban people have family in the United States. Many Americans have family in Cuba. So there is also this kind of humane connection between us, together with the cultural and historical experiences we both have shared for many years. So do that. Go to the streets, talk to the Cuban people. They will invite you to their homes. They're open. They will invite you to share their lives, and they will share with you the little things we have, but this is how the Cuban people are. Do it, please. Thank you.
Josefina, on behalf of ILAS and SIPA and all of us present this evening, thank you very much for a wonderful talk and for very effective answers to lots of questions.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.